Artificial intelligence is shaping how we work, communicate, and make decisions. But who's responsible when things go wrong? Today, we're talking about AI ethics with Casey Fiesler, the William R. Payden Endowed Professor in the College of Communication, Media, Design, and Information at CU Boulder. She studies how technology, law, and online communities collide in the real world.
I always say that because I love technology, I feel an obligation to make sure that it is the best that it can possibly be, that it hurts people less and it helps people more.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Let's Find Out, Arapahoe Libraries Podcast. Hear from authors, experts, and opinion leaders to spark ideas, solve problems, and enrich your life. In Arapahoe Libraries, we turn every search for knowledge into a helpful adventure. Professor Fiesler, thank you so much for joining us for the Let's Find Out podcast.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Let's start off with the big picture here when we're talking about AI. We've really been using AI for years now, right? Why does it suddenly seem like it's everywhere?
Great question. The term artificial intelligence actually started in the 1960s. We've had various systems that are considered AI for a really long time. And still today, there's a lot of different kinds of AI. It basically means any time that a machine is doing something that you would typically expect human intelligence to be doing. So everything from spell check to, social media algorithm recommending what movie you see, cancer diagnosis, these sorts of things. But today, when people talk about AI, they usually are talking about generative AI. And that is, for example, ChatGPT is an example of generative AI, image generators. It's basically a type of artificial intelligence where what is happening is that an AI system is creating some new piece of content based on what is in its training data, whether that content is some words, like if you are interacting with ChatGPT, or an image. But that's usually what people are talking about today when they say AI, even though there are a lot of other types of AI that have been around for a long time.
You mentioned generative AI, one of the buzzwords. I've also heard large language models. There are a few others. What are some other buzzwords that we should be aware of and what they mean?
Yeah. So again, artificial intelligence in general is anytime that a machine is doing something that we would normally associate with human intelligence. A really common type of AI we think about is machine learning, which is basically any kind of AI where something is being predicted based on training data. So this would include things like hiring algorithms. So if you build, an AI system to help you decide who to hire in your job, the way you do that is here's a bunch of resumes of people we hired, here's a bunch of resumes of people we didn't, create a model of what a good resume would look like. And you can give it a new resume and, it'll sort of filter them out. That's also how you get bias. So that's machine learning. And then a large language model is a type of generative AI that represents like what ChatGPT is, which basically means it's a type of machine learning where instead of predicting something, or actually it is predicting something, but what it's predicting is what word comes next. So ChatGPT, other large language models are extremely complex and incredibly good at this, but they're like next token predictor machines.
Understood. All right, now that we have a little bit of background, let's talk about AI ethics. When we hear that phrase, AI ethics, what do you think people most often perhaps misunderstand about it?
I think that might depend on who you're talking about. I think that a lot of people, when they think about ethics or, in the context of technology in particular, they think like, oh, it's about, like those buzzkill ethicists who are trying to like shut down innovation and regulate things and that sort of thing. So I think there are some people who feel that way. Other people think that ethics means like moral philosophy. I tend to think about AI and other types of technology ethics as being very applied, and being very about like today's, I think about it in terms of like today's real world tangible harms. I do think that it's important to think about the future. However, when I'm talking about AI ethics, it's not usually like, oh, I'm trying to save us from the robot wars, like, the things that might maybe be happening someday. I tend to focus more on things today. And that's in part because I think that ethics is actually about, if you think that technology has the potential to do good, then you should want it to be the best that it can possibly be.
Let's talk about the different people who use AI. There are some who are all in. What would you say to people who readily embrace these new tools? What warnings might you have for them?
I mean, I think that if you're going to be all in technologies like this, then the most important thing is that you understand how they work and what their limitations and impacts are. If you want to go very, very like basic level, for most big large language models that people use, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, all of those actually have a tiny little warning label underneath the where you type, and it says something like, this AI system might give you incorrect information, so you should double check important things. It's something like that. And I think that people tend to sort of figure that out as they go along. But that actually is extremely important. Not only knowing that a system like ChatGPT can give you very incorrect information, but why? And that goes back to the, it's a next token predictor and not, truth teller. Also, knowing ways that these systems can perpetuate bias, knowing about environmental impacts and thinking about that, and some bigger picture things, impacts on jobs, etc. And these are just all, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use these tools, but knowing these things and being thoughtful about how you use them and which ones you choose to use, and what you're doing outside of that, thinking about advocacy and what kind of regulation we should have and that sort of thing. I think all of those things are important.
And you may have answered my next question. That would be for the other folks out there in the world who are maybe a little bit more cautious about AI for whatever reason. What should they be aware of? And maybe those are some of the things they should look at.
I mean, one thing is that even people who aren't using AI systems are certainly going to be impacted by them. This is one of the reasons, for example, I teach a class on AI and society at CU Boulder. And something that was really important to me was that I didn't want students to not take the class because they had like a moral objection to AI and didn't want to use it. But it's also important to me that, one of the components of the class is that I want people to figure out for themselves what these systems are good at, what they're not good at, what the limitations are, how they work. And so I basically created a conscientious objector pathway through my class so that, I have assignments where students are, using the systems to do bias audits, and they're doing something themselves and then doing it with the system. But I also have assignments for students who really don't want to use them, because I think that even if you don't want to use these systems, you should understand how they work, what their impacts are, and that sort of thing. And for students who are really all in, I also really want them to know those things. So I wanted it to be welcoming to both of those kinds of students.
I'm glad you mentioned the class, because I think it's important to note that you study not just technology, but how people use technology. So why is it important to talk about this topic of AI ethics as a human issue, not just a technical one?
Yeah, so I'm in the Department of Information Science at CU Boulder, and we tend to think about our discipline and the things that we teach, how we approach our students as being really strongly at the intersection of technology and people. I really think that you can't just study technology in a vacuum, because what's the point? It's all going to be used by someone eventually, impact someone eventually. Even if you think about things that seem very theoretical, like, oh, I'm just studying sort of the mathy parts of algorithms. Every algorithm does something eventually that's probably going to have some impact on people. And so I think that's really important. There's a lot of discussion about like jobs in tech right now, and programmers, like AI is going to be doing parts of your job and that kind of thing. So I actually think that for people who work in technology, having a really good understanding of people and how they're interacting with technology and how it impacts them is actually going to be really important.
Is there a specific moment or maybe an example you have that made you kind of personally pause and think, well, wait, we really need better ethical frameworks for this technology?
There have been so many examples, like over a long period of time, right? Like we've had AI systems, versions of them since the 1960s. One of the very first things, I would say, like a sort of great grandmother actually of ChatGPT, was a chatbot called Eliza, that was designed to be a psychotherapist. And so basically it was sort of like Mad Libs. The way that it worked, you would say something like, I'm worried about my mother. And then Eliza would say, tell me about your mother, that sort of thing. And at that time, Joseph Weizenbaum, who created that system, wrote a paper in which he pointed out that people who worked with him were sort of fooled by this system. Even though they knew that it was a computer, they thought it felt very real. And even at that time, he was sort of warning about that. He said, I think that could be a problem. When people treat machines like they're people, when we don't understand that it's still a machine. So that was many years ago. And I would say that, the way that we're interacting with chatbots now, that's one of the things that concerns me. I worry a bit about people interacting with chatbots and not sort of keeping that distance and realizing that it's a machine, that it has limitations, and that sort of thing. And I think that's at the root of some of the kinds of problems that we're seeing. And then, I would say some other kinds of things in like precursors to generative AI, more along machine learning. There have been some really big problematic examples of bias in algorithmic systems. A really big one that people have probably heard about was that recidivism algorithms that the justice system uses to determine whether someone might commit a crime again. Those have been shown to be racially biased. So have facial recognition systems that law enforcement uses. I think it's really good that we have more awareness of this, that these kinds of examples get a lot of attention, because it's really important to know that those things are happening so that we can think about when we should be using algorithmic systems and when maybe we shouldn't.
Let's dive into algorithms a bit more, because we often see the algorithms claim to be neutral, but you got to wonder, are they truly neutral? So how do human values or intentionality or not get baked into AI systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I'll go back to an example I was giving earlier, hiring algorithms.
Okay.
So if the way that a machine learning model works is, here's a pile of people we hired, and here's a pile of people we didn't hire. Here's a new resume. which one of these piles should it go in? It's a very simplistic explanation, but that's what it's doing. And so if all of the hiring that you've done over a long period of time was influenced by human bias, then what the model learns is, we shouldn't hire women. And that doesn't even have to be influenced by things like names. Machine learning models can actually pick up on more subtle signals than that, things that humans might not even have picked up on. So there have been examples in the past where, resumes might sort of be downgraded because it has the name of an all-women's college on it, because it has, women's chess club on it. And we also know that humans have these biases because we have had decades and decades of resume audit studies where researchers send out resumes with different names on them. And oh my gosh, Emily and Greg are so much more hireable than Lakeisha and Jamal. And those are the kinds of things that algorithmic systems can learn.
Back to your point, it's not Barbara in Des Moines answering that question. It's a machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Many people, are, as you mentioned, are interacting with AI every day, probably without even realizing it. So where do you see most in kind of invisible ethical risks showing up in daily life right now, especially for the listeners of this podcast, since it's a Arapahoe Libraries podcast? They trust spaces like libraries for accurate information.
Yeah, I think that issue of trust is a really important one. And actually what we were just talking about in terms of biases baked into systems, I think a lot of people have this idea that machines are more neutral than humans, that they're less biased, they're more correct. You might trust something that you get from a machine more than you trust a human because humans are fallible. But this is a machine. It has to be neutral. It must be correct. And so that's one of the sort of everyday things that I worry about, is that people go into interacting with AI systems, whether that's they're going to ChatGPT intentionally or they're seeing the Google AI summary at the top of a Google search, and are reasonably assuming that it's not, lying to them. And I think that's one of the most important things for people to be aware of. And that doesn't mean that everything is a lie, of course. It just means that if it matters, if this is something where it would have some impact if this information was incorrect, that you should probably double check it, that you should find some way, to make sure that is real. I've heard from librarians for whom patrons are coming to them and asking for books that don't exist. And for sometimes patrons might actually get a little bit frustrated when the librarian can't help them find the book. So I think that's something important to know. If you are asking about that book because of something that you got from ChatGPT or from a Google AI summary, then you should know there is a definitely non-zero chance that book does not exist. And you might want to mention that to the librarian too, where you got it from, so they don't spend a lot of time looking for it.
Yeah. I hear you saying, check the source. That's a red flag when using AI-powered tools. So how could public libraries, help people recognize those red flags?
Yeah, I feel like evaluating the source of information is a really, really important skill and thing to remember, not even just in the context of AI. This also applies to just things we see on social media. I find myself falling into this trap too. If, I'm scrolling through my social media feed and I see something and there's no source, it's just a random person telling me that thing, it's not a journalist, it's not necessarily like a trusted source. I need to stop and think, do I know where this information comes from? Do I trust this person? And I think that's something, this is a big part of information literacy. This is something often that libraries are helpful with, it's helping people know how to evaluate the sources of information or helping them do that. And, what these AI systems have introduced is this new sort of like fuzzy thing where there actually isn't a source of information. So if ChatGPT is a next word predictor and it, hallucinates is the term that's often used for this, this book that doesn't exist, it's not that fake book comes from somewhere. It's a jumble of words, statistical probabilities out of this training data. So there actually isn't a source of information. So what you have to be able to do is just know that this source, ChatGPT, can be incorrect. And therefore, you need to be able to have some kind of secondary source of that information if it's important that it's true.
So when AI and the system causes harm, intentional or not, who should be held responsible? Is it the developer, the company, the user, the whole system?
Yeah, that is one of those $1 million questions, really. And honestly, a question that I suspect will be litigated a lot in the coming years. Accountability for these systems is definitely a bit murky. I mean, I think the answer to that, you're going to have sort of legal answers to that. You're going to have moral answers to that. And those might not necessarily be the same thing. And I think that it's going to matter a bit, the context, right? So for example, some like bad uses of AI that you might think of off the top of your head, maybe deep fakes, disinformation, people intentionally, making it look like a politician said something that they didn't say. That's bad actors using AI systems, right? So the bad actor is definitely to blame there. Why did someone do that? But you can also argue that the AI systems are also to blame. Do they have enough safeguards? Is it too easy, to use them in nefarious ways? And then there is also some responsibility on users to understand these systems and again, what their limitations are, and to know things. So I do worry about putting too much burden, on the user. So I suspect the real answer is a combination of things, and that responsibility will shift a bit depending on the context.
Do you think our current laws are keeping pace with AI development, or are we mostly just reacting when something goes wrong?
Our regulatory landscape around AI right now is definitely pretty fragmented. We are seeing a lot of state level, in the United States at least, we're seeing a lot of state level regulation and almost nothing at the federal level. In that way, it does tend to be a bit reactive. What we often see is something high profile, quite bad happens, and then we get a sort of a patchwork of laws around it. And then you go beyond the United States and think about how it's being regulated in other countries as well. And it's just a mishmash of a bunch of different kinds of things. I mean, honestly, the same is true for privacy laws. For example, like we have very, very few federal privacy laws in the US, and much of what we see is at the state level, or things that are like, frankly, if the EU has really good privacy laws, that tends to positively impact us as well, because it'll change how tech companies do things. So yeah, I will say that the regulatory landscape is shifting, but a bit of a mess right now.
Is there a particular state or country that's doing it well?
I mean, I don't know about well. There are different kinds of attempts, right? Okay. So the EU has a sort of risk-based framework for thinking about like different like systems that do different kinds of things and how much oversight they should have based on how risky they are. Colorado has an AI law that also is in a bit of flux right now. And then there are a bunch of like small laws in a bunch of different places. So Colorado, for example, actually has a specific law about election deepfakes. So often they're very specific.
Okay.
So I don't know that there's like any particular regulatory regime that has like figured it out. It's also a very hard problem. I mean, in the same way that like regulating social media is quite challenging. There aren't really clear answers on the best way to do this, honestly.
So what's your biggest fear when it comes to AI ethics? Is it the malicious use of AI, or could it be kind of these well-intentioned systems deployed with maybe just not enough thought?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say sort of, because I feel this is relevant to thinking about like the sort of information ecosystem and libraries that we've been talking about a bit. One of the things that actually troubles me a lot is not just about what AI, like specific uses of AI, but what its existence is sort of doing to our information ecosystem as a whole. And what I mean by that is particularly the challenge in knowing whether something is AI generated or not, particularly things like deepfakes, which have gotten much, much better over the past even year or so. Now I find myself scrolling through TikTok, for example, and seeing videos and being unsure whether they are real or not. And that state of uncertainty about what is real and what is not actually causes, I think, a lot of different kinds of problems. One is this just like this sort of fatigue of having to constantly verify information. There's also the fact that just like being in a world in which you don't know what's real or not means that people can claim that anything isn't real. And that also causes problems. So that's one specific thing that concerns me. And then I would say the other sort of like big picture thing is just like how everything around AI is really connected to these sort of like systems of power, and it's sort of centralizing power. I mean, AI companies right now have a huge amount of power in terms of the decisions that they're making. People hear about the AI bubble. There is actually like a non-zero chance that there could be a huge economic impact if it turns out that these systems actually weren't as good an investment as people have thought they are. There's quite a lot, I think, to worry about. But I will say the thing that you'll notice, these things I just said, they're not like the robots are going to rise up and destroy humanity. Like that's not really on my radar, for what that's worth, if that gives people any solace.
Yeah. I mean, you've mentioned areas that give you pause or concern. So let's look at the other side of the coin. What gives you hope when you think about the future of AI and ethics?
A lot of decisions around AI actually, all decisions around AI are human decisions, right? So if you think about AI is taking jobs, right? We hear that a lot. That's something that people are extremely concerned about. I think it's very important that we don't give AI so much agency that it lets humans off the hook. So it's not the case that AI is taking your job. It is the case that a human decided to fire you. And a reason that I raise that is because the utopian vision of AI is actually that it's so great that it can like do things for us so that we have time to do other things. Oh my gosh, like I can save so much time, and I can, I don't have to like spend hours making spreadsheets anymore. And instead I can write my novel. Oh my gosh, what if 2 programmers can do the job of 4 programmers now that they have AI to help them code? What if we paid those 4 programmers the same amount of money to work half as much time, and then they could like have more time off? That's the utopian vision of AI. That's not what we're getting right now, because now humans are making decisions to fire 2 people instead of to pay 4 people the same to do half the work. But I do think there's some possibility we could get there. The fact that these are human decisions means that we can make better ones. And I feel like a lot of these kind of decisions around AI are still kind of in flux. And people are starting to think about these kinds of things, downstream impacts, systems of power, that sort of thing. And I do believe that humans are capable of making better decisions that can create systems in which AI is doing work that helps us instead of hurts us.
Let's do a lightning round of questions.
Okay.
Some quick responses, if it's possible, with this giant topic. What guides your approach to AI? Optimism or caution?
I've always considered myself a technology optimist who considers critique to be an incredibly important part of that optimism. I always say that because I love technology, I feel an obligation to make sure that it is the best that it can possibly be, that it hurts people less and it helps people more. And I do believe that AI is an umbrella thing, not any particular system. There are some maybe I would just do away with entirely. Does have the potential, to really help people. And so in that way, I guess I am an optimist, even though I think a lot of people don't perceive me that way.
What's one AI myth you would love to see go away?
Oh, I mean, I guess, one of the things about AI and especially headlines is you see all of these AI is going to save the world and AI is going to destroy the world. And those are often coming from the same people, because no matter which one of those is true, it means that it's much more powerful than it probably actually is. And so I think I guess I would just like to see the hype die down a little bit, and just this sort of recognition that this is a technology. It has, its limitations like any other technology. It's not magic. And because it's not magic, it can be explained and it can be controlled.
What's one ethical question about AI we should all be asking more often?
Who benefits from this? I think that is often a question that we should be asking about decisions around technology. One of the things that I think is really important is that if some people are being harmed by technology, that also they're getting some benefit as well. And it's not the case that there's one group of people that's being harmed and one that's being benefited. And so, yeah, that's a question that I always ask myself when it comes to technology ethics, is who is benefiting and who is being harmed.
Professor Fiesler, thank you so much for joining us for this Let's Find Out podcast. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
AI doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course. It reflects human choices and human values. So thanks for listening, and we hope this conversation helps you ask better questions about the technology shaping your life. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Let's Find Out, Arapahoe Libraries Podcast. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and visit us online at arapahoelibraries.org.